So, Year 8. This lesson is all about the revision of the topic that we have just studied. I'm going to take you through all of the important bits that you need to know, and you need to make sure you have a pen and a piece of paper or your book to write down some notes. These are all things that you should have come across in the last few PowerPoints that we've sent out. So the first thing we're going to look at is competition and adaptation. In a habitat, there's a limited supply of resources. Okay, so food, water and space would be an example of the resources that would be there. And animals compete with each other, and this is known as competition. Animals compete for four main things: food, water, space and mates. Plants, also in the habitat, will compete for their resources to survive too. And they compete for light, water, space and minerals. Plants don't compete for food as they produce their own food through photosynthesis. You remember the equation that they need carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose and oxygen. So animals have to make sure that in order to compete for this, they are adapted to live in their habitat. And one of the habitats we've looked at is the desert habitat. It's one of the hardest habitats to live in, as the food and water is very scarce. The temperatures obviously get extremely hot during the day, and so most animals hide away or burrow to avoid daytime and are nocturnal. So there's only a few large mammals, such as the camels. They travel long distances to find their food, and they can survive for long periods without drinking. Animals like the camels are adapted in certain ways to be able to do that. Plants also live in the desert. They have another adaptations of their own. They have a waxy layer to reduce escaping water. They have stems that can store water. They have widespread roots so they can have a large surface area to collect that water. And they have spines instead of leaves, and this gives them a small surface area to reduce water loss, okay, and prevents the plant being eaten. So all the water that they're getting through that large surface area in the roots, they don't want to lose that in the leaves, so the leaves are then smaller and have a smaller surface area. Next, we need to understand how they adapt to change. So animals and plants can cope with changes in their environment. They can adapt depending on the seasons. So most animals will adapt by either hibernating or migrating to an elsewhere or growing a thick fur. This helps them to be able to have a good predator-prey relationship. They adapt to change in their food supply, and the best competitors will survive to reproduce. So when a predator feeds on just one type of prey, there is an interdependence between the predator and prey population. This means that changes in the population of one can directly affect another. So in the lesson, Adapting to Change, that was sent out previously, we looked at this graph where we looked at the hare and the lynx, and we looked at this idea that when the prey population increases, the predators have more to eat, they survive longer, they reproduce more, they increase the numbers then of predators, and that then has an effect on the prey because the numbers of prey fall. Eventually there's not enough food, so the predators fall, and then again that goes round and the cycle starts again. So it's important that we understand how animals are adapted and why they are adapted. So, with adaptations comes variation. Variation is the different characteristics that you may have. So you can easily tell the difference between certain things, like a dog and a fish, because these organisms belong to different species, and they have different characteristics. When an organism is in the same species, they have variations between them. Some variations can be inherited and others can be environmental. Many characteristics are affected by both inherited and environmental variation. So for example, you might inherit a characteristic to be tall from your father, however you eat a poor diet, your growth rate might be reduced. Inherited characteristics are not affected by the environment variation, are eye colour, blood group, genetic diseases. So it's important here that you understand the key words that you need to be able to use in the assessment. So the variation, what a species is, how the difference between inherited and environmental variation. So when we look at variation, it's very useful for us as scientists because we're able to plot the information in two different ways. We have discontinuous variation, and these are things where there's only two possible answers, so if you're male or female, or characteristics that are categorised. A continuous variation is anyone that is in a range. So for example, height of a population ranges from the shortest to the tallest. So you can have a value somewhere in between. Discontinuous variation is importantly plotted on a bar chart. That bar chart should have space in between each bar and show the relationship. With continuous variation, the categories are shown in a histogram where the bars are next to each other with no gaps, and they have a line to show the shape of the graph, and then it's easier to be able to look at the patterns. So when we look at inheritance and when you inherit characteristics, this goes back to your DNA. So your parents have genetic information that is passed to you. And if you go back to your reproduction topic, you know that a sperm and an egg have to come together for fertilisation. And the zygote that they produce will have 23 chromosomes from the sperm and 23 chromosomes from the egg. So 46 chromosomes in total are paired together, and on those genes and in that information on the chromosomes, they will tell you whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes, depending on the relationship. Inside the nucleus, your DNA is arranged into long strands. Those are the chromosomes. We have 46 as humans, whereas other animals like cats have 38 chromosomes. And that's what makes us a human being, is the chromosome number that we have. You inherit half your chromosomes from your mother and half from your father, so you will have characteristics from both. It's divided into sections of DNA that hold information. So these are your genes. One gene contains the information for the set of eye colour, and different genes for your hair colour, and different genes for other things. So there's thousands of chromosomes that contain thousands of genes. We understand that the DNA discovery was modelled and discovered by Watson and Crick in the early 1950s. Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkes, they actually started this prior to Watson and Crick, but we remember Watson and Crick because they were the ones that actually published their work quicker. Natural selection. Natural selection is the idea that species on Earth have gradually developed by selecting the most useful genetic information and ensuring that that is passed on in mating. This means that we are evolving, and evolution comes from the idea that you evolve through natural selection. You change slowly over time to become better adapted to your environment. It takes many years, and some millions of generations have happened to show those developments. The evidence for this is that fossils have shown evolution. The remains of plants and animals that lived millions of years ago have been preserved, and the fossils record evidence of species that no longer exist, such as the dinosaurs. So an example of this would be evolution, would be the peppered moth. Before the Industrial Revolution, the most of them were pale in colour. This helped the moths to blend with the tree bark and therefore camouflage. A few peppered moths were dark in colour, and this was a disadvantage because they were easily seen. So if you look at this photo, there's actually two peppered moths in the first photo. One is camouflaged by the tree because it's light in colour, and one is not because it's dark. However, after the Industrial Revolution, many of the trees become covered in soot and turned the bark very black, which means that the dark moths became more camouflaged and the light moths didn't. So the dark pepper moths survived and reproduced, whereas the pale moths didn't. So years later, you're unlikely to see now a pale peppered moth. We also in this topic have looked at the idea of extinction and how some animals, because they haven't adapted, have become extinct. For example, we looked at the dodo, a flightless bird native to Mauritius, lived on an island, was isolated, but then when people came to the island, they weren't able to adapt quick enough. They become hunted and they died out. We know that these animals existed because the fossil records show this. However, organisms have become extinct for four main reasons: changes to the organism's environment, destruction of the habitat, outbreak of a new disease, or the introduction of new predators or competitors. To try and prevent extinction, scientists have now started to look at those animals that are said to be endangered and started to develop what we call gene banks. There are a number of different types of gene banks, including seed banks, tissue banks, cryobanks, and pollen banks. It's useful for you to understand how that is going to help us in the future. So year 8, what do you need to know for the assessment? Well, here are the key points that we have covered in this topic. Animals compete for food, water, mates and space. Plants compete for light, water, space and minerals. Adaptations are characteristics that help an organism to survive and reproduce. Predators and prey species are interdependent. A change in population of one animal directly affects the population of another. Differences in characteristics within the species are known as variation. Inherited variation comes from characteristics inherited from your parents. Variation is caused by your surroundings, is called environmental variation. Many characteristics are affected by both. Characteristics can have only certain values and show as discontinuous variations, and characteristics that can be any value within a range show as continued variation. You inherit characteristics from your parents in your DNA, your deoxyribonucleotide acids. DNA is arranged into long strands called chromosomes. Each chromosome is divided into sections of DNA. The sections of DNA that contain the information to produce characteristics are called genes. Watson, Crick, Franklin and Wilkins worked together to produce the model of the structure of DNA. But history has shown that Franklin and Wilkins have not been identified for this, as they photographed the DNA but didn't publish, and therefore Watson and Crick published first. All living organisms have evolved from the common ancestor through the process of natural selection. This is one of the main theories in biology, although there are other theories. Fossils provide evidence for evolution, and if a species is not adapted to its environment, it will not survive, and eventually a species can become extinct. And gene banks can store genetic information from organisms, and that helps to prevent extinction. I've hopefully gone through everything that you need to know and you understand the key sections that you will. I wish you luck in the assignment that's coming to you and hope to see some really good results. Well done, Year 8. Keep up the good work.